Hi, this is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And you're listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast.
Chances are, if you're listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast, you are somebody who identifies as what is called the creative class. So what's the creative class?
Creative class is a term that Richard Florida came up with in his book, Rise of the Creative Class. And it's this concept, and Peter Drucker talked about, he's a business writer back in like the 80s, talked about the idea of a knowledge worker, someone who no longer goes to a factory to work, but instead goes to a cubicle, sits in front of a computer or typewriter, and manipulates information with their mind. And
that's the value that they give.
Exactly. And I think we're in an emerging culture of the next iteration of this. Not only are you working with data and esoteric facts and figures and kind of knowledge work in your head, but the current culture, the current creative class are creators by definition. Their job requires them to create new things, not just manipulate old things. And so they're coming up with new ideas, coming up with a lot of content, a lot of creation, a lot of imagery, whatever that might be, going forward in the world. And that kind of seems to be where the world's headed. No longer manufacturing's been commoditized, right? You can just get robots to build whatever. So we don't need people to necessarily be active in production of physical things anymore. And even knowledge work is starting to become that way. We've got what used to be back 20, 30 years ago, you had to have secretaries keep your calendar for you. Well, now Google Calendar, for example, online can do that. So knowledge work of organizing information isn't needed either. But this idea of creativity is becoming more important than ever, and we need more and more people, especially with the rise of the internet and the need for so much media and content and writing. It's growing in need, and so it's also growing in people that can fill that need. And so there's this rise of a creative class globally, and more like hotspots in particular countries and particular cities that is just exploding worldwide. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we say creative class.
Yeah, so basically so much has been automated that used to require labor, human labor to do. So much has been automated that humans are no longer necessary for these automated processes, like putting widgets together. And
exactly.
Like you said, a lot of knowledge work has been outsourced to technology as well. The one thing that technology can't do yet, though, is produce new thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have AI that's sophisticated enough to take over the creative, component. So humans are more and more necessary for being creative as being part of that, the rise of the creative class. And I would imagine that most people who seek personal development, most people who seek things like this style of podcast, see themselves as a creative class. Even if they're not technically in a profession that's allowing them to be creative, they still self-identify as being part of that creative class.
Absolutely. You might still be a knowledge worker in a cubicle or even working in a factory or something like that, but you have a sensibility of, man, I love to create new things. I love to be in sovereignty over my life and my vision of what kind of art or creativity I want to put out in the world, per se.
Yeah, so I think what I would really love to do in this particular podcast, and especially with your help, because you're a truly creative person. That's one of the things that has always attracted me to you, is how creative you are. And I've noticed that, in our library, when we got together, we married libraries. My books are now squished next to your books.
That's what nerds do.
Yeah.
You marry libraries.
That's right. They marry libraries.
It really is. We're looking at them right now, and our books are kind of like intertwined with each other. It's great.
And all of my books are, they're like the bicameral man, and they're all psychology books, and they're squished next to all of your books about like Disney's, SWAT team of what do they call them? Imagineers, and books like How to Get an Idea.
And comedy writing secrets. Yeah.
Comedy writing secrets. And I love that there's so much creativity now in my life, having been basically in your presence for so long. So I really wanted to talk about some of the things that, basically get from you some of these major ideas on how to be creative, because I think you've got it dialed in.
I'm guessing people in our audience have had the experience I've had. As a teenager, as a very young man, I had a very explosive creative time. My parents gave me some latitude to be creative as a younger person. And so I really developed a lot of artistic and creative elements. And then the real world happened, right? And that kind of became latent in my life. Like I had to get a real job and like make money and support some kids and a wife and like move through life in like a grown-up fashion. And some of those artistic and creative elements of me atrophied and began to like be suppressed or not accessed as much. And I'm guessing that you as a listener might have had this experience where you've had a creative explosion period, and then you've had to grow up, quote unquote, and get real, and you've lost a little of your sensibility to that. And one of the things I'm doing in my life in the last 5 years is reclaiming some of that creativity again. I mean, it never really fully went away, but now relish in it and begin to work again to reinvigorate this. And we always talk about, obviously, as personality hacker, personality types. And my personality type, one of my growth experiences for me in my individual personality is to be more creative, be more in touch with a creative part of me. And the more in touch I am with that creative part of me, and the more I'm in touch with the core values of that, the more growth happens, and the more exciting my life becomes, the more fulfilling it becomes, and the more just precious everything becomes, and the more exciting I am to live. I love being creative and doing all that.
I think you make better decisions overall, too.
Yeah.
I think the more creative you are and the more you tap into your creativity, even when you're having to make those quote-unquote real life big kid decisions, right? Like that adult decision, the quote-unquote real job, those kinds of decisions as an adult, the more you tap into your creativity, the higher quality your decisions become. Yeah. I've noticed that the more creative you are, the better you are at navigating your life.
Yeah. One of the books that has been hugely impactful for me in the last few years has been a book called The Artist's Way. And it basically is divided into 12 chapters. You do it over a course of 12 weeks. And each chapter breaks down kind of the core elements of what it means to be creative, what it means to be an artist. And she the writer defines an artist as anybody that's creative. It doesn't have to be an actual painter or writer, but anybody that's doing some kind of creative work. And she just walks through some of the exercises to begin to reclaim. She kind of talks about reclaiming your creative self, reclaiming some of those elements for yourself. And so as I'm walking through that, I'm making changes in my life, and I'm looking at how I've structured my life and how I interact with people and all the different things that happen. And I begin to make changes, and I've seen like growth happen in me going through this process. One of the key ideas she has in this book, and we might have mentioned this on a former podcast, but I want to formally mention it here, this idea of what's called a shadow artist. Someone who's had this desire to be creative in a particular fashion, whatever that is. I think she uses the example of like being a filmmaker, making movies or something. And instead of going after that dream, they end up getting a job or surrounding themselves with people doing what they actually want to do, or getting a job in the field that's almost just close to that creative endeavor, but it's not that creative endeavor itself. But they don't feel permission to do that creative endeavor.
Like a parallel career or something.
Exactly. Maybe an assistant to a film director. They're like or pulling cable, like being a grip on a film set, pulling cables or setting up lights, but they really want to direct movies, but they just don't feel permission they can do that kind of creativity. So they're going to just do a mundane job in the same field or around the same field, or become an agent or something. So she talks about this idea of a shadow artist and somebody that doesn't pursue that creativity they know is truly in them. And I resonate with that, saying, wow, I can see so much in my life and other people's lives I've noticed that tend to do this. We tend to shy away from the desire of our heart, the thing we really want to be creative in. And it doesn't have to be necessarily your career, but whatever that might be, your shadow artist might hide in the shadows and not want to come out and fully experience that.
Why do you think people do that?
I think because I think permission is a big key part. I think permission is probably one of the biggest factors. Is what right do I have to be creative? Like I was told all my life, get a sensible, I wasn't personally, but people might be told all their life, get a sensible job. Now you've got responsibility. You've got to lock that down. You can't be willy-nilly. They have this imaginative idea that being creative is like, you like have cereal in your hair and like you're you're drooling on yourself and you've got like paint on your pants and you can't like dress yourself in the morning, like you can't function.
Or you're one of those self-indulgent, self-centered artists that like, has to, is fussy.
Snobbery, like a snob or something.
Yeah.
So I think it's permission of, man, I can be creative in my life. I think that's the key. And I don't think I'm just talking about artists. I think I'm talking about any kind of creative endeavor, whether it's launching a new blog or writing a book or creating a business, whatever that creative endeavor is.
Yeah, well, I see you as more creative than me. And at the same time, I know that I'm living sort of the creative class lifestyle.
Correct.
I mean, I sell information products online. I do coaching,
Yes.
right? Like, people hire me for my advice and intellectual property. And
Yeah, a couple weekends ago, you were teaching a group of Australians in the middle of the night for us, which is
Right.
their daytime. I mean, you didn't clock in an office that day, but you
No.
certainly stayed up till 1 a.m. teaching a class
right.
to Australian students. So,
Exactly. And so even though I don't see myself as sort of artistic like you, I know that what I'm doing is creative. You know, I'm creating new content and I'm doing a lot of writing, and we create a podcast together. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into that, and it doesn't have to necessarily look like your traditional artist.
Yeah. So I would say permission is a big piece of why people don't necessarily pursue, creative endeavor. So I think the other piece of creativity that stops people from pursuing it is, I just mentioned the whole idea of, you don't have to be the guy with cereal in your hair and paint all over yourself. But there is something messy about creativity. It can't sometimes be quantified and measured and shown for itself. There's a lot of waste, there's a lot of excess, and it's not necessarily reinforced by everybody, particularly maybe an employee or your clients or customers or whoever you're working with. They don't want you to necessarily reinvent the wheel or be creative in a thing. They just want the bottom line of what they need. And so you tend to not have a lot of support also. So I think it's a combination of permission and support when you feel creative, but you're not fully expressing that in your life.
Yeah. I think that when we don't give ourselves permission to do things, it's impossible to give other people permission to do them.
I would agree.
Well, maybe not impossible. Some people don't feel like they have any rights, and so other people get to do the things that they don't get to do. It's really difficult, though. If you're not giving yourself permission to do something, you're not giving other people permission. And vice versa. If you're not giving other people permission to do something, it's going to be almost impossible to give yourself permission to do it. So when we are in a context where people give us repeated messages, even if it's all of society that gives us a repeated message that it's not okay to behave in a certain way, it's not okay to be creative, it's usually because all of those people aren't giving themselves permission to be creative either. So the question is, are they not giving themselves permission because it's wrong? Or are they not giving themselves permission because nobody else is giving them permission? like it kind of becomes this sort of snowball effect of nobody gets permission to do this thing. So when somebody like breaks free and actually starts pursuing creativity, I think they get a lot of resistance because, like, well, I'm not allowed to do that. Why are you allowed to do that?
Yeah.
That's why I think it's so interesting that there's a rise of the creative class, because the rise of the creative class means more and more people are giving themselves permission to be creative. Mm-hmm. More and more people are not saying, well, you're not supposed to do that. I can't do that. Why are you doing that? More and more people are saying, yeah, this is a necessary thing to do. And I'm going to be part of an entire movement of people who are becoming more and more creative. So I think our permission sort of thermostat for creativity is adjusting. It's adjusting to the idea of, it's okay to be creative. And I think it's because it's becoming more and more of a necessity.
Yeah. So
the balance, though, is like you said, creativity isn't efficient, right? Creativity is messy. There's going to be a lot of labor, mental labor that gets put into creativity that might go nowhere. And that's part of creativity, is that it's okay to be messy. It's okay to not be massively efficient. When you're building something that's never been built before, you're going to have to go through a lot of prototypes.
Yeah. I had my personal experience back in, 2005, I got a job as the assistant director of marketing and public relations at a zoo, of all places. And, basically in charge of the basic marketing and public relations endeavors and all that. And I saw the internet, YouTube had just come online. By that point, podcasting was just on the rise in the mid-2000s. And I saw an opportunity for us to begin to produce content for the zoo I was working at. And so I got an intern, a guy who had a camera, to come and start shooting videos, basically going around and interviewing animal keepers, highlighting different animals, and putting together a very creative presentation of a zoo TV formatted to promote the zoo, to promote the animals, to get the community excited, and created all the social media around this. And I remember when I kind of took the idea to some of the executives, they were like, all right, this doesn't make any sense. YouTube had just come on the scene, so this doesn't make any sense to them doing something online like this. They're thinking traditional media, traditional television, traditional radio, all that stuff. And so by doing this, they kind of were cold to the concept. So I went ahead and did it anyway around their backs, which tends to be something creatives do. We tend to get ask for forgiveness rather than permission. So I just went ahead and just did this, even though the executives at the time weren't necessarily gung ho about it. I thought, I'll proof of concept. I'll just go and do 10 episodes. Get a bunch of traction, show how popular this can be, and that'll show them. And so I went and I created this. Put a lot of effort and time into creating this. Would stay after hours to put my own personal time into it on my lunch breaks, whenever I could to create this. And it was really good stuff, I thought, especially for the time, in the early days of internet video. And they, when the traction was had and when the creativity came out, it was like, well, that's nice, but that's not really what we asked you to do. And, it's kind of like, almost like, that's cute. That's really cute you did that, but let's get down to business now. And, there's thousands of people downloading these videos, and there's thousands of people watching them and liking Facebook. And it was like this punch in the stomach to say, yeah, that was really cute. You did all that creative stuff, but we need you to be more serious now and like get back to task. And I bet as a creative person, if you're listening, you've had something like this happen where you've had the wind knocked out of you. You've done something and you thought was really creative, was proactive, was going to take things to the next level, and you got the wind knocked out of you and you feel like, man, I don't want to do this again. It's really just demoralizing. It feels so blah. But my encouragement is don't let that stop you. If you've had that experience of doing something creative and people haven't been warm to it, keep going. And I say that because I believe that you are needed more now than ever. And in the coming years, you're going to be needed more then than even now, because we are entering into a creative culture, a creative global community where there's not going to be less blogs that need to be written and less videos that need to be created and less great business ideas and marketing strategies that need to be come up with. We need more of those things, more people to think outside the box and think in a big way. And you're going to be needed for that. So don't let that discourage you if there's discouragement in the creativity. So I think that's another reason. You asked what stops people from being creative. I think it's also having the wind knocked out of them at some point. So it's the permission. It's this idea that the wind could get knocked out of you. And I think that's, this stuff altogether stops people from wanting to branch out.
Yeah, that's really, that's an interesting idea that the world's not going to need less creativity going forth.
Oh, no.
Right? It's only going to need more. And that made me think of, I was just recently talking about the music industry and how the music industry as a whole is basically so staunchly and stubbornly holding on to their old business model. Right?
Well, if you notice, they call themselves the record industry, not the music industry.
Right.
Because they sell records, physical records, CDs and music, physical,
Yeah. And it's like the technology has rendered their old business model just about obsolete. And they can't let it go, right? They're instead of altering and changing their business model, they're trying to police people into, going back to their old model, right?
Yeah.
And that's ridiculous because the technology has virtually made peer-to-peer sharing online, torrent sites and peer-to-peer sharing. The only way to take P2P down is to take down the internet. Mm-hmm. That would be the only way to stop peer-to-peer, sharing, torrent sharing. And so they've lost. Mm-hmm. The record industry, they have already lost. So what is the salvation? The salvation is a creative idea that alters how they do business, right? Because there's still a crap ton of money to be made, right? There's still so much money to be made in the music industry. And that's proven by, people in the music industry make way more money than, say, actors on TV or in movies, right? Celebrities on TV don't even make a tenth of what musicians make, right? When they're at the top of their game. There's so much money to be made in music. And it's going to require the creative class. It's going to require somebody coming up with a creative solution to save the entire industry, and it's going to require the industry being open to these creative new ideas. Look at Louis C.K. Louis C.K. has figured out a way to make it so that his audience gets the content online and he still gets paid for his efforts.
Yeah.
And it's because he's not all that worried about money, but he's also not all that worried about doing things the traditional way. Like, he's going to do it the way that makes sense to him. And because of that, he creates a win-win for everybody all the way around. And he does this as a comedian by offering his live stand-up shows online for like $5 a pop, right? Like, pay me $5 and you get to download it, right away on my website. Cut out the middleman of distribution, just come straight to my website. And he makes a crap ton of money, and everybody gets their product for a really reasonable price, so they don't feel like torrenting. It's almost more expensive to go to the trouble of torrenting than just spending $5 on an artist you like to support their content.
Well, and it's going directly to him and his efforts. It's not going to some corporation where they're going to pay a bunch of executives for sitting around and dreaming up marketing plans or something.
Exactly. And so there are lots of really great ideas out there for how to salvage these entire, these intellectual property industries that have nothing to do with the old models. And it's the creative class that's going to come up with those concepts. So it's not just creativity is important for, exporting, entertainment. Creativity is required to save industries, to figure out new styles of effectiveness.
And even something as simple as, there was a creative idea that was put into the prisons of Norway, where if a prisoner reads a book while he's in prison, he can actually lessen his sentence time.
Book reports.
Like,
a prisoner can remove their sentencing time based on each book report that they write on every book that they read.
What a creative idea.
Oh my God. What a fantastic idea.
It's taking a very old school model of which I totally disagree with, how we imprison people for things that are not violent crimes. And obviously this wouldn't work for a murderer or a rapist or someone, but these are people that are imprisoned for punishment, not because they're dangerous. And it gives a creative idea to help them begin to grow themselves. And it's a creative idea. It's a win-win it gets them out of the prison system faster. And when they get out, they're more equipped to deal with the world. It's a great concept.
It's closer to rehabilitation than a punitive system.
Exactly. And I bet you it was a creative class person that came up with this idea. And it was a creative class person in some position of authority that said, let's try this. Let's see how this works. Let's give it a shot. Let's try this new model of how we deal with prison and see if this will work in our country, our culture. The jury's still out on how effective it totally is, but these are the kinds of ideas. The creative class isn't just limited to movies and music and stuff. It can be in any industry. You as a creative class person, it doesn't matter what job you do during the day.
Right.
There is creative elements you can bring to that job.
Yeah,
I don't care what it is.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's why there's a rise to it, because technology is outpacing our old models so quickly. Right? Like, our technology evolves so much faster than a pre-technological boom. Like the world before the internet, there were a lot of models that were around for a really long time, right? Like, those models lasted for a long time. And so their obsolescence is really sort of like jarring to us. We're like, but this worked for so long. Why isn't it working anymore? And it doesn't matter why it's not. The answer is because it's not. Because technology has outpaced the old models, and now we need new models. So the creative class isn't just, like you said, like the artists with paint all over them. It's people who recognize that we need to be coming up with new ways of doing things as fast as technology is advancing. And that means that we need to get to step in, because technology outpaces itself every 8 months. It doubles in capacity every 8 months on average. And it's giving us so many new ways of seeing the world and interacting with it. We've got to have a lot of really creative minds working together to create solutions that will keep up with technology.
Now, this means that business and culture is going to be more forgiving and more accepting of failure. And create a culture where failure is celebrated as a learning experience rather than a punishment. And I know you've got a great concept that we've talked about. Actually, I gave a talk about this a year or so ago at the Inbound conference in Boston. This idea of sins of omission versus sins of commission. And oftentimes people will they won't take an action based on a potential punishment for the sin they could, like if you make a business decision, I make a bad business decision, I might get fired. But if I don't make a decision at all, well, they can't do anything about non-action. So as long as I'm making my numbers or whatever, that new creative idea, I can't get punished for not acting on it. So this sin of omission, we feel like that's going to protect us. But in the end, you might have missed out on a huge business deal, for example, or a huge new creative opportunity.
On average, sins of omission are actually more costly than sins of commission, but they're harder to track.
Absolutely. And so businesses need to get better at saying, look, there's a space here where we want to try new ideas. We want to try new ways of doing this. And we know that, you're not going to always have wins every time. But we are going to create a space where you can have that excess and that bumping around inside this container and figure it out for the betterment of the business or betterment of the culture or whatever that is.
In a business context, I think the word mistake is probably better than sin.
Yeah, correct.
Mistake of commission versus a mistake of omission.
Excellent clarification.
Yeah, because there's not really sins, but they're mistakes. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think as business progresses, there's going to be an understanding that failure is part of the test iterate process and actually gets you to your goal faster. As long as you're increasing the quality of your failures, then failure is not a problem. You don't learn anything through success, right? Like if you succeeded the first time, it meant that you already knew how to do that, or you just got lucky and you don't know how it happened.
Yeah.
If you make a mistake, now you can go back and see, you can see where you made the mistake and you can learn from that. And so folding mistakes and folding failure into the process is oftentimes how companies get to, the meteoric rise that they do. The Virgin brand is a great example of this. Richard Branson's Virgin brand. Oh my gosh, they've made so many mistakes and they've learned through all of them. And so who has taken over the planet like Virgin? Yeah. Right? So folding this in, and that means being open to creativity, because creativity is built on the back of mistakes.
Yeah.
And so, fail again, fail better. That's the whole concept. So yeah, absolutely. I think creativity requires people to cut themselves slack during mistakes. And in fact, actually embrace mistakes, embrace failure, as long as they're increasing the quality of their failures each time.
Yeah.
What are some of the suggestions that you would give to generate creativity in a person who already feels like they're creative, but maybe has been stifled in the past, maybe hasn't given themselves permission, maybe has been told that creativity is not, that's not acceptable or okay, and is like you, trying to reclaim their creativity?
There's a lot of things you could possibly do. I think starting small is always good. Like starting where you're at, and starting small for you might be bigger than someone else, starting bigger than someone else, but start at a place that's manageable for you, maybe in something that I'll tell you what it is. It's having, I would start on something you have sovereignty over, actually, because I think that is somewhere where you call the shots. So probably it's going to be, if you have a day job, and like I did, and you have the gumption to go and create a video series around something at your job, that's cool. Try that. But if you're like, man, I don't want to mess with my job, I might lose my job, or this is not something where the executives are going to be happy about, or I don't feel comfortable trying this new thing here. Try it in a place in your life you do have sovereignty, or maybe your family situation or your community somewhere. Maybe it's just your physical environment, the way you do your house. Maybe do it in a radical, maybe make a room in your house a radical bohemian style room that looks like a crazy hippie flop house from the 60s or something, just to see what will happen. And keep asking yourself, what's the worst could happen if I try this idea, and just try some of those things. I think that's the first thing, is to start where you are able to right now in that. And then I think that giving a lot of space and time for creativity, playfulness is really important, I think. Like getting down at a child's level and crawling on the floor again like you did when you were a kid. I mean, remember what it was like when you were a kid and you were creative. What were the things you were doing? And literally replicate those things. You mentioned this, I think it was yesterday, the day before, we were walking on the sidewalk in town here, and I jumped up on the side of a railing, like or something.
Retaining wall.
Yeah, a retaining wall. And I was like, I'm a man in my 30s with my arms out, kind of balancing along this retaining wall in public where anybody else my age would be like, dude, what are you're acting like a 7-year-old. And you said to me, I love how like wonder filled your life is, and you still act youthful and playful when we're out, and it would be embarrassing for other people to act this way potentially. And that's something I try to bring into my life, is just act like I did when I was 7. Like I do things that adults aren't supposed to do necessarily. Sometimes people look at me like, what in the world? Like this, if I'm in like the grocer with a cart, we have our daughter in the cart, I'll like jump on it and zoom through the grocery store at fast speeds and make car sounds to entertain her. But ultimately it's entertaining myself. I have to admit, like, she's an excuse for me to be able to act like a 7-year-old. I love it. Like, I love that kind of, so I think it's giving yourself space, it's giving yourself playfulness, and it's becoming more childlike in some ways to open up that creative part of you.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a litmus or a litany of things you could do. In the artist way, she talks about particular styles of journaling. I'd recommend you go get the book. If it's probably right under this podcast in the podcast notes, but get a copy of that book. It's a great book if you want to reclaim creativity. There's another book that I think is great by Jack Foster called How to Get Ideas. Another great book on how to capture ideas. And he talks about this concept of ideas are like actual physical things bouncing around a room, and you almost have to like grab them and write them down before you lose them. And he has a lot of ideas in there similar to what I'm talking about, like getting childlike, like getting down at a child's level and remember what it was like to be that creative force where the world was just totally open to doing new things. If you can start bringing some of those elements daily, maybe for just 30 minutes a day, playfulness, childlikeness, I think that will start opening up creativity. If you're having a creative block, I would venture to say a lot of people have in mind what they want to do creatively. I think it goes back to that permission piece.
Yeah.
How do I feel like I don't have permission to be creative now.
Yeah.
More than even how to be creative.
I think that being willing to be childlike in public is probably a massive leverage point. A lot of times when we don't give ourselves permission to be creative, it's because we are fearing social censure. And if we practice or exercise not giving a damn, right, by being in public and behaving in a way that could appear childlike, and knowing that other people might be frowning upon us or thinking that we're a nutter butter or whatever, it's a muscle we build, right? Like, not caring is a muscle you build in your brain. So practicing that on a daily basis, right? Like just not caring if somebody sees you, dancing in a crazy way, or, we've got a lot of those, we were talking about, this is probably going to become like sort of the style of this decade, like macrame baskets were in the 70s. Yeah. Like those beaded macrame baskets in the 70s, those pot holders were sort of like in my childhood and memory of like the 70s and 80s.
Green and orange colors.
Right.
At least here in the United States it was.
Yeah, exactly. And that was sort of like how I see the style of like the early 80s. Those inspirational posters that have all the words on them in different font sizes and stuff, and they're like, sing,
put them around
like,
your house.
Yeah, exactly, dance like nobody's watching. Those are probably going to be like sort of the thing that our kids remember as sort of the style of this decade. But I freaking love those things. I buy cards and floor mats and like, I've put them all over our house. And it's because it reminds me on a regular basis that, I need to be acting like an idiot and being okay with that. Like, it's okay to act like an idiot sometimes. Not hurtfully, but, in a way where it's like, I'm not going to be self-conscious about how other people are judging me socially. And the further I get away from having my finger on the pulse of social censure, the more open I am to new experiences and tapping into my personal creativity. So I think that what you mentioned is that youthfulness, bringing that youthfulness to the world is a massive leverage point in giving yourself permission to be creative. And then, like keeping crayons around the house, right? Like keeping things that are colorful and
we have whiteboards around our
in every room we have a whiteboard that we can just kind of walk over and doodle on or write down ideas whenever we want to. So I think that's a big piece of it too.
And caution about whiteboards around your house. If you have a 2-year-old child, you have to help her distinguish between what is the whiteboard and what is the actual wall. Yeah. Creativity gone too far.
That's right. Magic erasers are a beautiful thing. So I think this is an important idea. I don't think this is just sort of like be creative in your life and it makes your life more fun. I think creativity is important. And I think we are leading to a time period where creativity isn't going to be just something that we do expressively. We're going to be doing it out of necessity, which is a fascinating concept when you think about it pitted next to all the dystopian novels of the sci-fi dystopian novels of last century, which painted all of our futures as being massively uncreative, and it was all going to be about control and this government that had sort of whitewashed everything and everybody was supposed to be the same, sort of in a Gattaca sort of way. We actually are moving into something completely opposite of that. Our future is going to be filled with far more creativity and far less, command control, and everybody's got to be the same.
Business and government are panicking because of it. The other thing I think about the creative class, the other thing I think about the creative class is that it tends to be people who are lifelong learners. I think part of creativity also comes from being willing to, this fail again, fail better, but it's also learning all the time. You're open to learning. It's no longer going to be, I've thought this for a while now, it's no longer going to be, you're going to college for 4 years, you graduate, you have your skill you've learned. I think it's going to almost like learning is almost going to be like a subscription, something you subscribe to, like literally like a magazine almost. Like you subscribe to learning, quote unquote. I don't know how it'll look necessarily. We've seen some of it rise. I mean, what we do is kind of like that. We have educational experiences and materials for people around personality psychology, about models of human development. People literally subscribe to that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a college course in that over a period of time, and maybe a lifetime for some people, that you keep improving yourself. And I think school or education is going to be something you will subscribe to ongoing as a creative class person. And so if you're not inputting and learning new stuff all the time, if you're not seeking out new ways of growing for yourself, it's going to hinder how creative you can be in your job, your career, your community, your family, whatever. That's really key, I think, for creativity to blossom as a creative class person.
This doesn't just have to be nonfiction books too. I think fiction books come in here as well. Lifelong learning, lifelong reading, and that sort of thing. I think fiction is just as important as nonfiction in this. And my recommendation, based on what you just said, because I think that's brilliant, that's absolutely true. I think a person, this is a personal, I'm just going to be my personal opinion on how a person should behave, quote unquote. I think that the most successful people are people who always have a book going. Like there's always a book they're in the middle of reading. And
that means I'm super successful because I've got like 20.
I know.
I literally have bookmarks in like 20 to 30 books at any given time.
I have book locations. I have like one book next to my bed, and I have a book in the bathroom, and I have a book in my backpack, right? And I've got like 3 different books going at all times. I've got a book here at my desk. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe that's a little too much. Maybe that's
that means you're super successful.
Yeah, or maybe that we need to like focus a little more on one thing at a time. But that said, yeah, always have a book going. That's a recommendation from me personally. Always have at least one book going at any given time. And I do think that really opens people up to new concepts, new thoughts, and keeps them up to date with that creative class.
Yeah, I would say. And I think the other piece then, maybe wrapping this up, is community. I think community is the other piece. Is if you're a creative class person, you are going to atrophy unless you're around other people who think like-minded to you. And we talk a lot about finding people who are like-minded, finding the offbeat characters, finding the people in your life that think like you, that don't think like everybody else. And that's going to be key for you as a creative class person, particularly if you're at a transition point and you're getting ready to transition out of maybe a traditional job, traditional role, and you want to move into maybe a business or a creative artistic endeavor. You need to surround yourself with people who are kind of on the same journey, who think like you do, who can be supportive, who you can help support, and create a community around that is really key, I think, if you're ready to make that transition in particular.
Yeah. Find communities or find various styles of input. Lots of input.
Yeah.
And people are the best input. They're great for, those greenlit conversations of generating new ideas with each other. Absolutely. It's all good stuff.
Yeah.
Any final messages of recommendations for keeping your creativity up?
No, I think we covered all of them. I think it's good. I think good. What I'd like to hear is from you. What are you thinking about creativity? Do you self-identify with this concept of the creative class? Are you somebody who sees yourself as creative no matter what role you're in career-wise? What are your thoughts about this? Do you have ideas on how to grow creativity? And in more particular, how to give permission to yourself? And has there been a point in your life where you've given yourself permission and you've had some successes or some failures and you've learned from some of that? We want to hear from you.
What did that look like?
Yeah.
That decision point of giving yourself permission to be creative, for those of you who have done that, what did that look like for you?
That courageous decision.
Help us crowdsource. Help us make it so it's higher quality for others to be able to learn from, and benefit from your experience. So what you can do is you can go to personalityhacker.com. You'll find this podcast on the website. Underneath is a place to put comments. Please share your comments about being creative with us. We would love it. And it definitely benefits other people who go to the website and read those comments, to give them permission as well. Be a part of the conversation, be a part of the dialogue, and be part of something that could be inspirational to another person. You can also find us on Facebook at Facebook.com/personality hacker. So go ahead and like us on our Facebook site. That's also where you're going to get all sorts of cool stuff, including, when we post these podcasts. And you can also find us at Twitter at Twitter.com/personality hack.
Yeah.
And so thank you very much for joining us. I'm Antonia Dodge.
I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And we will catch you next time on the Personality Hacker Podcast.